The Man on a Mission in the title of this thing. And I've been thinking about how in doing live streams like I am right these days, I'm in the position that Adam Sandler was in the movie 50 First Dates. His situation is that he's in love with Drew Barrymore. And Drew Barrymore wakes up every day forgetting everything that happened the day before. So that in romancing her, he has to start over from the beginning every time. And it has a happy ending. I kind of like the movie. I like a lot of movies that sort of play with time and magic and things like that. But in any event, he she wakes at the end. She wakes up with a video that introduces her to what the situation is, and then they have a day together where she understands that she's married to him, that they're in love with each other, and they've been together for a while, and they even have some children, I think, at the end. But on the way, he has these 50 first dates, and that's the stage that I'm in on my mission. I'm not trying to get Drew Barrymore to be in a committed, loving relationship with me in spite of the fact that she doesn't remember anything. But I'm in the situation where to achieve my mission, I need to get a following. And my mission is to convey a rather big picture. There's a lot to it, what I really want to get out there. And I want to get it out there because I think it could have a beneficial impact. But the fact that I have a big picture view that's got a lot of things to it means that I need to be able to engage in an ongoing process with people. I need to get a following. And I've had a little following for half a century practically, but for this to have that beneficial impact, it has to get a bigger following, which is why my firstborn son encouraged me to get on video like this to reach a larger group of people. But I've also been told that to achieve what I'm trying to achieve, which is to convey something that can't be conveyed just in one serving, that I need to find a way to engage with people enough so that maybe they'll subscribe, or maybe they'll look at all the various other videos that I've been making. Or maybe, and this is what I recommend to anybody who is into reading, and I'm hearing people don't like to read anymore. I don't know how true that is, but I've been a writer and have seriously worked to show that whole big picture. But you can't present that big picture in a single setting. So I've been told that right now, in the process of building the following that would be necessary to accomplish my mission, that I should imagine that whoever is listening to me, this is the first time they've ever heard me. They got no idea what I said before. And as they're like Drew Barrymore, I need to make them fall in love with me, every day. And that's an interesting situation to find myself in, particularly because I feel like as I build this following, I also have an obligation to those people who are saying, okay, let me see where you're going to take me. You've got enough credibility on what you say you can deliver, and I'm interested if you can deliver. So just tell me, keep talking to me, but don't bore me by repeating yourself every time. If you're going to be Adam Sandler, you got to be creative about it to create messages that at the same time are winning for Drew Barrymore. The Drew Barrymores out there who are seeing me for the first time, who will say, oh, that's interesting. I think I'll subscribe. Or I'll go to his website, a betterhumanstory.org, and I'll see what it all is that he lays out. And I think you will find out there's a surprising amount there that both illuminates the crisis in America today, which is part of the big picture, but an even bigger picture, which has been my life's work. That book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, puts forward a very big idea that should change the way we understand some basic things about the human story. It should change the way we understand what we are as creatures. I think I can show, for example, that the ugliness that we see in human history is not human nature writ large. I mean, I think I can, to my satisfaction, I can prove it. So anyway, how to compose something that Drew Barrymore will find, gets them to take a further steps, subscribing or whatever, and at the same time, if I do succeed in building a following, and I have some young men, in a sense, managing me, who have gotten me into doing this, who tell me that it will likely develop. So it's to talk to Drew Barrymore and also be interesting each time to anybody who is doing what I would hope, and that is tuning in by subscribing, tuning in on Monday at 11 in the morning and Thursday at 11 in the morning. So part of my strategy, one strategy I have, is I'm trying to be 100% open and hoping that that in itself is persuasive that there's something real perhaps to be had here. And the other thing I do with each one of these episodes is I start out with something that's smaller picture. I have this belief that people are a whole lot readier to engage their minds with things that we're already thinking about, and this isn't the time where a lot of people are thinking about really big picture things, and that's another part of the picture I want to paint. But there is a lot of really good thinking that I find widespread in the world about a lot of particular things. And so a couple times ago, I talked about, in the wake of the Kansas City thing, I started off this man on a mission by talking about, in the wake of the Kansas City shooting, talking about the pathology in American politics about guns. And I connected that with the battle in America these days between democracy and fascism. And the politics of falsehood is another thing that I've done lately in the video. And the gun issue is an example of the politics of falsehood. It is indicative of what's being accomplished here, that it's accomplished with a lie. I dealt with the issue of guns as a way of persuading tens of millions of Americans with a lie about this absolutist reading of the Second Amendment. I think a quite false reading, but that's just beside the point. That's the foundation of all our liberties, when it's quite obvious. You just look around the world, you can see that there are lots of free societies that have a much more sane balance between individual rights about guns and the public safety in relation to guns than we do. And they're just as free as we are. But tens of millions of people believe that. So I've also, I've talked about, and this is a political force. It doesn't just lie about guns. It lies about everything. And that's what I go through in the politics of falsehood. And then I think it was the last time I was on here, I talked about student debt. And I talked about how the way we're handling the education of our young, beyond the high school education, K through 12, that we provide for them without bankrupting any families is just folly. It's on. It's it's both a crime and a blunder for a society to do what we're doing by loading student debt on people. I mean, society really should invest in people, quite obviously. I mean, we know that when we established a public education system. The reason we pay for the education of all our young, supposedly K through 12, is that we understood that a society, if it's wise, will invest in its young. And there's just, anyway, I talked about student debt. And I tried to, I chose these topics because I feel like I've got something to say. And usually it connects with the big picture, so I can go from there. And if I can't find a good bridge, I don't think student debt had a super good bridge. Well, maybe there is a good bridge. I mean, partly what we're up against in America is a plutocracy. I hadn't thought about this, but I think the reason that we've got these policies in place is that the plutocracy has way too much power, and those people. They can afford to send their kids to Ivy League schools. By the way, I'm an Ivy League graduate, but I don't come from a rich family. I earned it, as the old ad had. But they don't need to have the state make available to the children of the middle class and the working class, and maybe even the poorer. They don't need to, because they've got it covered. They got plenty to shell out. $55,000 a year to educate their young to take their place in the elite. Maybe that's why I mean, when I went to school, people of my generation were not coming out of college with a mountain of debt. Neither should the people young today. So I talked about that. I thought I had something to say. I think it is important to point out that this is part of the picture in which the society is getting sort of rearranged to serve a governing few at the expense of the increasingly struggling many, and the widening gap of wealth. It's the same party that keeps on passing tax cuts every chance it gets that transfer money. Last time in 2017, it was in the million, 2 trillion from average Americans and from future Americans to enrich people who are already super rich at a time when the country already has a gap between hollowing out between extremes that when I was growing up in the 50s and we looked around the world about where can we help democracy to flourish, if there was a degree of inequality like you see in America today, the experts would say this would be very difficult to build a democracy because of those inequalities. That was true in a lot of places in Latin America as those experts studied it. And so these people transfer huge chunks of money. Reagan did it, W did it, and then in 2017, Trump was happy to sign the rest of the Republican Party. Their one priority, they had control of the whole government, but there wasn't anything they were that interested in doing except this massive tax cut, which they sold on the basis of lies. And the politics of falsehood is all over the place. So my strategy is then to start, which I will now, on the little topic of the day, and it isn't little. I mean, it's just relatively little compared to the a better human story that I want to get across. It's a particular arena in which we can see clearly the nature of the battle in which we are engaged. I have spent 20 years trying to tell the non-fascist component of the American body politic, which is liberal America, to the Democratic Party. I've been working for all this time trying to show the nature of this battle that's been rising, that I saw in some ways in the early 90s when Rush Limbaugh arose. But it was in 2004 that I really saw what was rising, and I've been putting out the alarm and pretty much been frustrated. But it is very important that we see the big picture. Seeing things whole is really necessary for understanding the important things. I think that that's a general principle. It's one that I've operated on. So anyway, if we see things whole, let's look at this Ukrainian situation where, a couple of things happened lately that show, I think, how to look at this situation. One is that Donald Trump lately said something that got a lot of attention, and rightly so. He told a story. I would bet 10 to 1 that it's a fabrication, that it's a lie, that the conversation he's describing never took place. He's just made it up. He's a fabulist. I mean, this man, his relationship to the truth. So we've got Trump saying that basically, like he's running as the president of the United States, in relation to our NATO allies, he's a gangster running a protection outfit. You don't pay up. I'll even encourage, Putin to do whatever the hell he wants to with you. I mean, here's the United States, the leader of the free world, that for throughout the Cold War and ongoing, we have been legally committed. We have joined with these countries to protect them from Russian aggression. First as the Soviet Union, and now we got this other kind of Russian tyranny. And it is our role in the world that we protect the peace and freedom of our Western European allies. But he makes it out to be a protection. Be a shame if the Russians took over and we just stood by, which is what he said he would do. And that sent shockwaves through Europe. They don't know what their future is now in a way that they always could have assumed that the United States is committed to defend. But if this guy gets elected president of the United States, all bets are off. Huge. Huge. I mean, American national interest. This is not folly, what we're trying to do with NATO and what we're trying to do with Ukraine. This is protecting something that American presidents since Truman have understood to be a central national interest of the United States. And it ain't like Donald Trump has somehow got some insight into the national interest. He doesn't care about the national interest. He showed that with the pandemic. But even worse than that, well, at least just as bad, he's actually on the other side. That's what's going on here. The Republican Party, as the Trump Party, is a force of fascism. I mean, you can see that in its conduct, in its goals, and in the kind of human monster that they've put on at the top. But it's not just Trump. It's the Republican Party. Partly because they follow Trump, but there are signs that that's where they've been for a good while. It's been rising since before Trump came in 2015 and hijacked the party from this force. But they are able to form some alliance. In the House of Representatives now, that alliance works that the leadership is being controlled by what Liz Cheney has called the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party. The new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, I remember, it's not McCarthy anymore. I think he is in alignment with the fascist force, but he's also willing to sacrifice, even if he would himself think that we should be getting arms to Ukraine. He knows that if he were to put the measure that the whole world is waiting for us to pass to get arms to Ukraine, the Ukrainians are dying because the Republicans are blocking this aid package. I mean, it's just visible to the whole world. Think what that does to American national interest, to lose that kind of credibility. The President of the United States has committed us to a purpose that he rallied the whole Western world to achieve, which is a super bargain in terms of protecting American national interest per dollar. I mean, I'm not the only one saying this. This is doing NATO's job with a fraction, a tiny fraction of our defense budget, doing a huge job in bringing down and at least seriously wounding our greatest adversary on the planet, Vladimir Putin, who's been going at us in a very aggressive way for quite some time, including helping Donald Trump become president. Oh, my. It's a super bargain, but the Republicans in the House of Representatives are blocking it. I wonder, what's going to happen with this. I sort of cling to the hope that some of these things that say, well, they're going to get through this, at some point. I mean, a discharge petition, apparently that's very unwieldy and time-consuming, and already the Ukrainians have had to withdraw from this city that was so hard won. And because we have not passed in the House, because a tiny group of Republicans, with the either having coerced or with the willing cooperation of the Speaker of the House, won't let it come to a vote. If it came to a vote, there are still enough Republicans who would join with all the Democrats, and they would pass it in a minute. And there'd be a tiny little wing out there that would vote against it. I don't know how tiny, but I expect it would be a minority, even of the Republican Party, and probably even a small minority. But they control the party, so that's what the party is. I have some Republican friends. We get together sometimes, two Republican couples and my wife and me, and we get together on the basis of we don't talk politics. And I find it interesting, but I don't inquire exactly how does this work. I mean, I can see that they're holding on to the Republican identity that they've always had, and they're not pro-Trump. And I kind of wonder if I felt it would be okay for the friendship for me to press them on this matter. I would press them on. Can't you see that the Republican Party, you don't like Trump, but you're still a Republican? What does it mean to be a Republican but against Trump when the Republican Party is Trump right now? But I think a lot of things go deeper than you can reach with a logical argument, and certainly that's true on the right. There's something about the realm of the virtue of loyalty that I've observed in completely different circumstances. But the conservative side of things, everybody believes in loyalty, but on the right, the value of loyalty is way bigger than it is on the liberal side. And it's got to do with the whole nature of the relationship with authority and conformity too. There are different mindsets that tend to inhabit the different sides. But anyway, this is the Trump party, but it's not as though only Trump makes this party fascist. I mean, some aspects of what they do are because Trump tells them to do, like killing the border deal. But some parts of it, like the basic fascist leaning, exist in the party independently. I mean, for example, there's that big conservative group. What's it called? CPAC or something like that? I don't know. Or is CPAC something you do if you've got apnea problems? Anyway, they love Orban, the fascist leader of Hungary, a guy who, by the way, has operated as a member of the EU in a way that's very helpful to Vladimir Putin. Being helpful to Vladimir Putin is one of the signs of the fascism of both the party and the leader that they follow. The Putin wing of the Republican Party isn't just is blocking aid to Ukraine, not just because that's the way Trump would have it. It's also because somehow there is a Putin wing. Liz Cheney knows what she's talking about. When she says pro-Putin, she's leapfrogging past Trump. But Trump is important in this picture because we know from having watched him in his first term that Putin is his buddy. You remember that disgusting moment at the press conference in Helsinki, I think it was in 2017, where Trump, standing on the stage with Putin, says he believes what Putin says, that they didn't meddle in the 2016 election, contrary to what all of American intelligence, I think it was 17 different agencies got together, and they reported on the ways in which Vladimir Putin and his operatives were trying to help Donald Trump win this election. Now you could say, well, it serves Trump's purpose to say, of course, there was no such help, because an American president doesn't want to admit, this Russian dictator here wanted me to be the president of the United States. That does not reflect well on an American president. I mean, to let the guy who's our major adversary choose who's going to be wielding the powers of the presidency, which is pretty considerable power when it comes to international relations. And then he proceeded to act like he was Putin's agent. He was working in collaboration with Putin to strengthen him and weaken the democratic force in the world. First of all, he continually worked to alienate our allies. That bit of video that was just so cringeworthy, where he pushes one of our NATO allies, a minor ally, but an ally, the head of, what was it, the former Yugoslavia, name the province, which is now an independent nation, in Montenegro. He pushes the guy aside. He knows how to behave. I mean, he may be a boor and a man who would rape a woman with his hand, but he knows how to behave if he wanted to. This is that was all part of basically giving the back of his hand to our NATO allies. Boy, is that would that be high on a Putin wish list? And then that first impeachment was all about what he was doing with Ukraine. He was withholding arms from Ukraine, which was already, we understood, and it was American national policy to support Ukraine in being able to hold back the Russian aggression that was already not just poised, but acting against them. In 2014, they seized Crimea, that the Russians had agreed was going to be part of Ukraine, back when they split up after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The United States, under Trump, acted like an ally of this fascist power who has been working to undermine democracy in Western European nations like France and Germany and even executing its political opponents on the streets of London. That is the thing that the Republic, that Donald Trump has been working to do when he was president. Meanwhile, we've got another election coming, and so I lately wrote a piece about on the question, will the American victory in the Cold War be reversed? The American victory in the Cold War is fundamentally a victory of the free societies over tyrannies. And that is the nature of the dynamic that what's at stake in American politics right now is that the Republican Party is aligned with the tyrannical spirit that we've always been opposed to, even if we were sometimes hypocritical about it. So when Trump basically throws NATO, because he's a potential future president. I mean, if they knew that Trump wouldn't be president, who cares what this monster thinks, that he's a gangster thinking he's running but no, this guy might be inaugurated in January. And then the leader of the free world, the country that has been the predominant military power that makes NATO an effective deterrent against Russian aggression. It's a party that's withholding aid to the Ukrainians, so the Russians might succeed in a disarmed Ukraine, and at the same time, they're opening the gates to what Trump has somewhat openly threatened. The Baltic states, he says, that are now part of NATO are really part of Russia, and they would be under the gun. And Trump is signaling that he wouldn't necessarily come to their aid. But we are bound by treaty. So this is brokenness begets brokenness, which is one of the things about the world. We could end up with the United States and Russia engaged in a war against each other. How that would play out, or the fall of Western Europe over time, because the fascist part of the power that's risen in America has aligned itself with the fascist power in Russia, switching sides and giving the Cold War victory that the free world won back over 30 years ago, back over to fascism. That is what's at stake in the 2024 election. And I believe that the American people will not take that route, but I also worry about it. These Russian advances that we see in Ukraine, they are the result of the conduct of the Republicans in Congress. And it is not only destructive at that level, but it weakens the whole power of democracy in the world. Part of the bigger picture is that this battle between democracy and fascism is pretty much of a worldwide phenomenon now. In the Cold War, it was worldwide also, but in a narrower sense. It seemed like it was explicable in terms of mere great power calculations. At the end of World War II, there were basically two major powers on the planet. In the United States, which had been victorious in World War II without having undergone any great national trauma on its territory, which differentiated us from the Soviet Union, by the way. It lost millions and millions. And the Soviet Union, which was also victorious in that war. And I found out as I grew up that, the American victory over the Nazis, which I still like to watch, in the movies, like The Longest Day and all that stuff. But I'm told by the historians that what happened between the Soviet Union and the Nazis on the Eastern Front may have been an even more important blow to the Third Reich. So, two great powers. And pretty soon, before the 40s are over, these two previous allies are becoming adversaries, and it's an ideological kind of challenge. At least so it's announced by both sides. But it's also, what happens when you got two great powers in an anarchic system like the world always is. And particularly when you've got one of those great powers that's under the terror, the Stalin terror is a phrase that characterizes the Soviet Union at the time that the Cold War developed. This is an extraordinary human being in a very dark way. What happened in the Soviet Union in terms of the totalitarian cruelty, the gulags, the purge trials, truly really showed as vividly as Hitler himself how tyranny tends to put power in the hands of really ugly people. I mean, the ideal society, you might say, is one where you don't have to worry about the politics working well, where you've got an all-knowing, all-good, all-wise, God calling all the shots. I mean, people make mistakes. If you had a all-wise, benevolent dictator, that would really work well. I mean, you look at American democracy now, and it's in terrible shape in terms of being able to accomplish what we know we need to accomplish. But even if you look back toward better times, you can see that there are limits to how well anything can be. So it is possible to have a good God make things better. But that is just the opposite of what comes to power when you've got tyranny. And when I use the word fascism, partly I use it responsibly. I know something about what I'm talking about. But partly I'm also using it as shorthand for sort of a more fundamental dichotomy than fascism versus democracy. It could also be top down versus bottom up. It could be democratic versus tyrannical. It could be, I don't know, I could go on trying to spin out some of these things. But there's a sense in which Stalin, Hitler, and what Trump is right now advertising is the nature of what he would do as a regime. And that's that they're all basically kindred in both spirit and in the workings of power. Unaccountable power versus checks and balances. The many being exploited by the authoritarian regime versus the power system being constructed to exercise by the people, for the people, and by the of the as well as of the people. These are fundamental dichotomies, and that is, in some sense, been something that's been at stake since the rise of civilization. Hunting-gathering bands don't have this issue. The word egalitarian tends to be used about this. As soon as civilization arises, you got tyrannies with the first empires and all that. In fact, the battle between democracy and tyranny, I don't know how it took a long time before there was a democracy or bottom-up kind of force. Or at least that's my understanding. I like to label what I know and what I don't know. I mean, think of it. The English celebrate the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. And we Americans, at least it was true when I was growing up, we get taught our civics history. We talk about the Magna Carta being like the beginnings. And maybe if that's true, I mean, all they did with the Magna Carta was to say that the power at the top, I guess the king, because, Robin Hood's enemy was the bad king at that moment, that there were limits to what he could do with this handful of nobles. So the aristocracy in the Magna Carta gets some devolving of power from the absolutism at the top to having rights for themselves. But it's, as far as I know, in English history, I think it's some more centuries before they start laying any more foundations. And then over here on the other side of the Atlantic, these sons of Lincoln. I don't mean to be sexist, but so we got people like the people in the House of Burgess in Virginia, and the people creating a somewhat democratic system in Massachusetts, and the Quakers in Pennsylvania. That we got something happening here, which is more democratic than what was happening back in the mother country. But even there was further progress. So the battle between democracy and tyranny, there have not been, for very long, much of a democratic force. But the United States helped to put that something on the map. And the Soviet Union ended up conducting elections. I mean, Ivan the Terrible never conducted elections, but they had to put on some window dressing because democracy had become prestigious in the world. And the prestige had a lot to do with how the United States was able to conduct itself, and with the fact that we were both mighty and rich. And then we won the Cold War, and we won it peacefully, which was a wonderful accomplishment. But Putin has got an alliance with a power on the Republican Party, and specifically with this guy Trump, that threatens to shift the balance of power seriously. I mean, if you could move the leader of the free world into being an ally of the most aggressive fascist leader in the world, the guy who single-handedly sundered the hard-won peace of Europe, if they could swing this mightiest nation on the world with the greatest military from the side of democracy to the side of fascism, wow, what a victory for tyranny. I, I think that we should understand these things in a more integrated way. I've heard some people on MSNBC in the last less than a week, anyhow. I don't remember who that was. I'm not withholding the names, but really good people asking each other, what does Putin have on Trump? I mean, they see that Trump is working as a partner of Putin, but they're helping each other, and also the idea that's being, and I've heard this over the years, ever since early in Trump. What does Putin have on Trump? Okay, at this point, we know so much about Trump that I ask you this: what could, if in terms of blackmail, what could, I mean, even if he had videotape, as people thought maybe was the case, of Russian prostitutes urinating on the bed in the yellow whatever the rumor that was in the that informant Steele's dossier, as just reported as a rumor. I could believe it, except he's a germaphobe, so I don't know. But even if we had a video of that sort, anything that people might conjecture, what could Putin possibly blackmail Trump about that would be worse than many things we already know? We already know what he did to E. Jean Carroll. We already have seen the monstrous way he treated his obsequious vice president, just because the one thing he wasn't willing to do was what he had been compelled to understand, was he wasn't willing to sacrifice his oath to the Constitution to do what Trump wanted. I mean, can you imagine what kind of a guy would encourage a mob that's chant Mike Pence to punish him for putting his constitutional duty ahead of being an accomplice in the crimes that Trump was determined to commit? We already know that when the pandemic came, the testimony we've got from reliable is that he didn't show any concern about protecting the American people. He was just interested in seeing how to play this for his political advantage. This has always been the danger of the tyrannical system. I mean, maybe over time you can construct ways of making it less terrible. I mean, the regime that lost the Cold War was a lot better than under Stalin. I mean, it evolved right away after Stalin died in the direction of away from terror. But the people who seize power are often monsters. Putin is a human monster. All you got to do is look at what he's been doing in Ukraine. I mean, it isn't just he invaded his neighbor. It goes way, way beyond that, into atrocities, crimes against humanity. Putin seized power after Yeltsin handed it to him. Hitler got in a position through an election from which he could seize the kind of power that would make him part of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. He seized power. Trump tried to seize power here in the United States, and they're all human monsters. You know, Saddam Hussein, you know, he waded to his absolute rule of Iraq through a sea of blood that he shed. Human monsters get there, and then the regime gets to be just monstrous in a more day-to-day way. So that it's just instituted that there will be hundreds of thousands of slaves building pyramids to house the pharaoh when he dies. I mean, that is a broken world, is it not? But I don't see the pharaohs as being, Saddam Hussein's. But anyway, we've got a global version of this ancient struggle going on the world today. And the American situation and the American, Russian, Ukrainian situation are part of that, but the picture is bigger. It's part of it in that the Republican Party is being governed by its pro-Putin wing. I mean, the Republicans, at any moment, if they had any moral character, could take power away from that pro-Putin wing. That is what American national security requires. They could do it any minute. At any time, the non-pro-Putin wing that would vote if they came onto the floor could simply say, we're going to elect a new speaker. And they could elect a speaker to replace this guy that's willing to do what the pro-Putin wing wants. They could elect a speaker with their votes, plus, I mean, they only need a few to go with all the Democrats. They could even elect Hakeem Jeffries speaker in order to defend American national interests that are being squandered. We've got Putin on the ropes, for Christ's sake. And we're going to let him off the ropes? Well, that's worth a little revolution, but the Republican Party is sufficiently bankrupt that they don't take a stand. You know, the integrity that Liz Cheney showed that she had is apparently a very great rarity in this party. And I think that goes with what we see about there's not a lot of public spiritedness in tyrannical regimes. There's ugliness at the top, and there are people who are happy to assist ugliness to get their own desires met. And maybe even that they believe in the ugliness. I think that a lot of people who did Heil Hitler are getting off on all that. But others are just opportunists. Anyway, the Republicans could end this any moment. And it would be good to dramatize the extent to which this is not about Putin having something on Donald Trump. It's their allies. And the Republican Party is also allied because they let themselves be controlled by the pro-Putin wing. We are engaged in a great global struggle over who will wield power and will there be any rules that govern how power is used. Now, my book back there has the subtitle, The Problem of Power in Social Evolution. Power is at the core of the human problem. It is an inevitable, the emergence of power as a terrible problem for a creature is a given inevitably when it takes a step onto the path of civilization. My Better Human Story starts with the idea that that moment when a creature steps out of the natural order, when a creature extricates itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life, that is an unprecedented event in the history of life. 3.5 billion years. I mean, that is just, if you considered a timeline, if you had, I don't know exactly what the numbers would be like, but imagine 100 yards of rope from the beginnings of life all the way till on this earth, there gets to be a creature that starts inventing its own way of life because it's got a creative intelligence that is beyond what any other creature had had. That it takes that step. If you had that 100-yard long rope, I think it would be the last fraction of an inch that something very different happens. Something that's shaped by the imagination, the invention of the creature, and not by the process of natural selection. You know, we've had the Darwinian understanding in our civilization for over a century and a half. I mean, not everybody, of course, but it's been there. But we haven't looked at the implications of it enough. I think partly it's because the Darwinian perspective focused, in a sense, on the origin of species. He's taking it is a magnificent idea, but it was more focused on the competition rather than seeing the overarching synergies of the system that is the result of natural selection. Natural selection doesn't just select for, the line that emerges in the branching speciation. It does select for those, but it also selects for a pattern of relationships among all those different lines. One of the ways in which I like to put it is that the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine. And that's what you get, a perpetual motion machine, when you select for what can get its DNA into the future, even as they devour each other. In other words, in the immediate level, you see competition, you see nature red in tooth and claw. But in the overarching level, you see synergy, because that's what works to get viability, meaning surviving for the long haul. The interactions are regulated, not by any kind of government that's top down, but it's regulated by what naturally emerges systemically. When you've got a process that's continually choosing what can survive to get its DNA into the future over what cannot. Gregory Bateson, who's one of the more creative thinkers of the times when I was getting educated, said, no creature can win against its environment for long. Think of that. In the Parable of Tribes, I have a way of putting that. It's got to do, I use the idea of when the wolf falls upon the sheep, which was, it's a nature red in tooth and claw thing. But I say that it's a pattern of survival, not only for the wolves, but for the sheep as well. And we see this kind of thing when you get rid of the predators, the prey will be out of balance with the synergies of the old ecosystem, and they might become overpopulated, and they might strip the grass so that it doesn't return, and the desert spread. And that actually happened in North Africa when some early forms of human civilization meaning departing from the pattern of the hunting-gatherers, but herders in North Africa got out of the order that natural selection had created, and they led to the spreading of the Sahara Desert. That's the way it works, and that's illustrative of how this unprecedented step and the turning of a hunting-gathering species into a herding society, it does represent an early manifestation of that unprecedented step. It's people inventing a new way of life that wasn't what they evolved to have. And what I demonstrate in that book is that if you're going to create a new kind of life form and extricate yourself from the old order, you're inevitably going to find yourself in a disordered situation where there'll be these new life forms that are going to be interacting with each other. But unlike the wolf and the sheep, and unlike the lion and the zebra and the grass, these interactions are not regulated by any order, neither naturally evolved or human imposed, because it's all fragmented. And there's going to be a disorder, and the nature of that disorder is anarchy. And that book is about how anarchy inevitably creates a problem of power. I could take that further, and this is really a foundational idea that really opens up the picture to develop a whole new understanding of the human story. There is, I think I can more or less prove not only that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large, but another way of putting the same thing, that any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, parenthetically I'll say, I'm imagining that there are a lot because of the numbers of possibilities involved, that takes a step onto the path of civilization. In other words, takes that unprecedented step, takes that fateful step, will inevitably plunge itself into that kind of disorder, which will inevitably subject it to a social evolutionary force that selects for the ways of power. And there you have how you get to why power is a problem. If you're going to have inevitably anarchy when you make the breakthrough to civilization, and I think that is inevitable, and if that is inevitably going to create the kind of disorder that results in a war of all against all, and I think that can be proved too, that means you're going to get a selective process where only the ways that enable a society to prevail, and I call those the ways of power, are going to survive and spread. In all other ways that might be better in other respects, but if they're not going to be able to survive in an anarchic system where there's a war of all against all, they're going to get eliminated. So we already know that because we have been this unique species that took the evolution of life into new territory, creating a new system that didn't get created by natural selection, and therefore having to find a way to control the disorder that we have unleashed. They're going to any creature that goes on the path of civilization is inevitably going to be confronted with that kind of problem where the ways of power are selected for. And what can prevail in a war of all against all? Well, it's got a lot in common with the question, what kind of a human possibility is going to govern if the power is going to go to the kind of person who sees his power? And we've already seen, you tend to get human monsters in that situation. I mean, anybody who really were to operate by the principle, say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, they're not going to end up being a tyrant. The kind of person who ends up being a tyrant is going to be a person that really is willing to sacrifice the legitimate rights or feelings or whatever of other people in order to satisfy their own desire for power. Stalin didn't mind killing millions. Hitler didn't mind killing millions. Donald Trump didn't mind that 200,000 extra Americans died because he was focused on himself rather than on protecting the country when he was president of the United States and a deadly pandemic came through. It's an ancient problem, but we're in a particular piece of history, you and I, in 2024, where we've got an American election coming up, which is part of that ancient battle. And we've got a global picture in which, according to an organization that studies the state of democracy globally, the democracies have been falling back, losing ground since I think it's 2006. And there's, and we can see that. There are countries which 20 years ago, well, let's just say 25 years ago, let's go back to the end of Clinton's term. We look around the world. We look at Turkey, for example, and we see a democratic society. There are issues, of course, but it's still pretty much continuous with the vision of the democratic Turkish leader Ataturk back in the 1920s, I believe it was, where he established a secular democratic society. Well, it's been more than a decade, this fellow Erdogan, who's an Islamist semi-dictator, definitely represents a more fascist, a gain of fascism over democracy, the extent to which he's taken Ataturk's version of Turkey and turned it into this thing. And we can look at India. When I was growing up, India was the world's largest democracy in terms of population, and it was headed by a very decent, London-educated, humanistic ally of Mohandas Gandhi. I forgot how you say his first name, but Nehru was the name of the guy. And it was a democratic society. Now, building a democracy in a society like India, for a variety of reasons, is not easy. And they've struggled. How many people are illiterate and how much poverty there is. And they've got their own tribalisms of Hindus versus Muslims. It's been hard to navigate ever since the moment the British let go of their colony, and they ended up splitting, as Gandhi didn't want, into two nations: the Muslim Pakistan and the Hindu India, with a large Muslim minority. But they were a democracy more than they are now. Over the last, how many years has it been? This Hindu nationalist party has taken control in India. Why? Well, I don't know enough to say, but I think it's partly to be explained by whatever's going on that also moved Turkey, because there's a list of countries that are apparently independently moving in the direction of dictatorship and fascism. And this Indian nationalist party, which shows no sign of losing power, and has done some fascistic things like what it did to a major opposition leader about jailing him, and what they're doing in terms of enforcing their orthodoxies. Um, and anyway, it's easy to make a case that if you consider fascism in a kind of a broad way and look at the various components of it and tendencies of it, they don't all have to be identical in all respects. You don't have to have death camps like Auschwitz, to qualify. But Modi's India has, and commentators on, I'm not, the only one saying this. Even, opposition. Some people are taking risks and trying to say something about it in democratic India, which isn't nearly so democratic anymore. Big movement in that direction. And then we saw what happened in Brazil. I mean, fortunately, an election undid that. And the defeat of Bolsonaro seems to be sticking in the way in which the defeat in 2020 of Donald Trump. He's getting a rematch. It looks like Bolsonaro's out for good, but he was definitely he was ugly in most of the fascist ways. I mean, there's just a spirit of brokenness that you can see all over the place that congeals on these things, and that leads to another thing, which is that the spirit of fascism is sort of a part of a larger picture. That what arises with civilization and the war of all against all, and what I say is the ascendancy of the spirit of the gangster, inevitably as a part of the systemic dynamic in which a war of all against all is leading to the rise of the spirit of the gangster. And you can see that, by the way. We've witnessed a couple times in the world, sort of the experiment being conducted for our edification. I mean, not that it is, but when power broke down in Lebanon in the late 70s and early 80s, anarchy, and then when power broke down in Somalia in the early 90s, anarchy, you see that very soon warlords emerge as the people in charge. They may be at war with each other for at least a while, but that's what comes to the top. The human world as a whole doesn't consist only of these kinds of human monsters, the gangsters. But there's a systemic dynamic that goes around, and it picks the ones that can prevail. And the ones that can prevail are the kinds of warlords that we saw running around Mogadishu and on Somalia with machine guns mounted on their jeeps. Europe ran that experiment. Back in the Dark Ages, there were these marauding gangs. And the most successful gangsters ended up being inhabiting castles and exploiting the serfs and passing along their power to future generations who became aristocrats, nobles, so-called. They were just the descendants of the gangsters who set up a world in which power operated from the top down, same battle that we're engaged in now. There's been a plutocratic power that's been rising in the United States for quite a while. And it makes use of all the brokenness that there is in the American civilization in order to further the brokenness of its gaining power and supplanting American democracy with a kind of regime that exploits people on behalf of the plutocracy. Plutocratic it tends to be a part of what fascism is. There was a big plutocratic element in the fascism that allied with Hitler when Hitler took over. I think the plutocracy, the kind of force that put these Supreme Court justices in place, I think that they think that they can be okay with Trump. And they did okay with Trump the first time. They got their big tax cut. And but I think that I don't think they really want to be with him. But they may think that they can do okay with him. But then there are some plutocrats that are funding Nikki Haley. I find that very interesting. I think that's representative that the Republican Party would like to be free of Donald Trump. On the whole, they're hostage. They are held hostage by Donald Trump now, who wields the Republican base against them. But I don't think they want him. I don't think they want him around, and I think you can see that in the fact that Nikki Haley, who has no chance of being the Republican nominee. I mean, even if Trump dropped dead, the delegates to the convention that had been elected would not turn to Nikki Haley. She's been going after their God, and they are unforgiving of that. She would definitely be Liz Cheney'd away from the nomination. So I don't know who would be the nominee, but Liz Cheney is not going to be the nominee, but she's still going after Trump. And I think that should be understood, particularly in view of the money that's going to fund her continuing a campaign that is not going to get her anywhere close to power anytime real soon. I think we can say that that represents a part of the plutocratic power. The Koch brothers are involved in that, as I understand. They think they could do better getting the Republican Party out of the hands of Donald Trump. Now, I've paid attention to the plutocratic power, and particularly when I ran for Congress in 2011, 2012 in a very red congressional district in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. I understood that I was, that among other things that were lined up to make sure that their Republican incumbent stayed in office, there was the Koch brothers. I also had Liberty University in my district. And when I was a participant in a debate against my Republican opponent, 20-year incumbent named Bob Goodlatte, it was interesting the way they arranged the debate. I would say it gave him maximal protection against my having the opportunity in terms of being able to speak for more than 45 seconds to expose the lies that Bob Goodlatte is parroting as Republican talking points. But I understood that Liberty University was not a neutral party. You know, I hope you don't mind that I allow myself to ramble a little bit. I mean, a lot of things I've said, could be expanded on a whole lot. And if you want to see how they really all fit together, please go to my website sometime and take a look at abetterhumanstory.org. But anyway, I want to go to. I have been in Lynchburg a bit before I ever had anything to do with politics, and before I ever even lived here in the Shenandoah Valley, where I've actually lived for almost 32 years now, since I moved out here into this part of the Confederacy. But I've been to, even before that, I was in, and I knew that Jerry Falwell, this was in the age of Nixon, and Jerry Falwell was a right-wing Christian force who commanded what was called the moral majority, and who founded in Lynchburg a university called Liberty University. And I didn't know much about Liberty University, except that it was a reflection of Jerry Falwell, whom I didn't see in terms of fascism, but I did see as representing a kind of a theocratic political force. Um, he wanted his his version of Christianity to dictate a lot of our national policy, and that's why the moral majority was considered an important part of the Reagan coalition. But I didn't, I didn't. That was to me, definitely on the other side. But I didn't see it, any kind of threat of fascism, and I didn't even see. I didn't see it as a malevolent spirit. Um, I'm not sure if I missed something then, but when I ran for Congress here, this was, Jerry Falwell, I believe, had already died, and Jerry Falwell Jr. was the head of Liberty University. And I understood that they were allied with Bob Goodlatte, the Republican incumbent, that they had in previous years done things that were beneficial to him, providing him with a forum, having him be an honored guest at graduation. But I wasn't ready for the experience of entering into the political world in which Liberty University was a player, to be the experience that it was. There was something very dark that I encountered. As the Democratic nominee for Congress, I would go all over the district and meet with like-minded people who wanted me to succeed as much as possible. And there were some important allies down there in Lynchburg where the Democratic Party had been, sometimes was, a political force in a way that wasn't true, say, in my county here, Shenandoah County, where the Democrats, have 30% of the vote on an average day to the Republicans 70. There were some really good people that I met and worked with, and one woman in particular was who everybody, all the people in her Lynchburg Democratic circle spoke of her so glowingly, and they were so impressed with her. And she's the kind of person that when we got a Democratic governor, got appointed to an important position. And I met her, and she was lovely, and she was impressive, and she was courageous. But she and several other people that I had occasion to interact with as I came, did the circuit throughout my district, which was a big district. I did 25,000 miles in the course of my 2-year campaign. But going back and back to Lynchburg, a picture gradually emerged. I mean, this brave woman, when she talked about Liberty University and Jerry Falwell Jr., she had been traumatized by these people and wounded. And several other people had had experiences like that too. I mean, they went after people in ugly ways. I don't remember the details. I don't know if it would be appropriate for me to try to tell a story. But I heard some stories, and these are people who had encountered something which they conveyed to me, and it was I think it's the first time in my life that I sort of felt the cold wind of being right next to something evil. Yeah, well, I reported that eventually, and now we see that I don't know whether Jerry Falwell Senior um, was the opposite of being Christian. It was like this stunningly hypocritical thing his son was. I mean, we now, first of all, there was a sexual scandal involving Junior. that concerns me really less. But what concerns me more is the way in which this Liberty University republicanism had no difficulty embracing Donald Trump. Jerry Falwell Jr. played a big role in legitimizing Donald Trump with the evangelical Christian world. And as everybody who pays attention knows, the evangelical Christians of America have been a big part of of that reservoir of support from which Trump has derived all his power. And there was this Jerry Falwell Jr. supporting Donald Trump, who I would say is quite the opposite of the values that Jesus taught, and who, as an actor in the world, acted like a thug. Not only a thug, but a vicious and cruel thug, as I gleaned from the interactions I had with these good, intelligent, decent people who'd had experience of him. Going back to what we see going on around the world about this battle between democracy and fascism, in which the question of getting this aid passed in the Congress is one of the key places, because we get such a huge return in bloodying the nose of fascism for every dollar we send to keep the Ukrainians well armed to push the Russians back and punish Putin for his blunder and weaken him and the force of fascism, of which he's been the primary leader in the world for 20 years. So this battle has been going on at a lot of levels. Our election, the Ukrainian battle, and also something going on at the global level. So we got countries as disconnected as, let's see, I did Turkey, India, Brazil, and let's throw Israel in. Israel's been it's situationally challenged and always has been for making democracy work under conditions of chronic threat of war, and under conditions of having a minority living in their midst, and in the condition of having to deal with the fact that they occupied by war still other territories. But nonetheless, Israel has been in many respects a really vibrant democracy from its founding until I don't know exactly where to draw the line. It wasn't a good sign when they elected, when Ariel Sharon got elected, became prime minister. I mean, it's a parliamentary system. He was real tarnished character because of a connection with war crimes that he seems to have allowed to be committed by Lebanese Christians against Palestinian Muslims. Is that what it was? These two camps. I used to know the names of Shatila. And anyway, back in 82. No, or is it 2002? Anyway, and then we come in, I think, 2009 to the return of Bibi Netanyahu as Prime Minister of Israel, leading a right-wing government, but a pretty traditional right-wing government. A right-wing government that was made up of a party that had given us a previous Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, who was pretty hawkish, but was still part of a healthy democracy. But then Netanyahu became the longest serving Israeli prime minister and showed some sociopathic tendencies that were made him a somewhat fascistic, his way of governing. And then when he, like Trump, completely selfishly sacrificed his democracy by bringing in fringe characters to get himself back in power with a coalition that contained people who had been too extreme for previous right-wing governments. Starting in, I think it's December 2022, the new Netanyahu government became more fascistic and set to work to make it even more fascistic by eliminating an independent judiciary, and was essentially precipitating a kind of civil war between the forces of democracy and the forces of fascism right within Israel. It's really a shame that the vicious assault of the Hamas on Israel took place with this government in place. I mean, I say it's a shame, but I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that they realized that this government gave them an opportunity to set the trap and feel confident that the Israelis would jump right into it. Because that's the way fascists respond to provocation. There's a pathology at work in the fascist mind that results in overreaching and overreacting and failure to tolerate and a lack of the kind of psychological wholeness that might enable somebody to recognize that one's initial impulse of vengeance be the most constructive way of achieving one's purposes. Well, Hamas set the trap. The fascistic Israeli regime jumped into it. Anyway, we have the most fascistic government Israel's ever had. So with all these different countries having moved in the same direction, in the same 20-year period or whatever, the question arises, why are these disconnected societies moving in the same direction? I mean, what's Brazil got to do with Turkey? Or Turkey got to do with India? That I mean, there's always going to be some regimes fall, some things become more democratic, some things, but no, the observers of this issue of democracy are telling us that democracy's been losing ground in a fairly concerning way. And you know, I actually I find this a very appealing mystery because my whole life has been spent trying to understand the forces at work in the human world. It is a very rich world that we live in, not nearly as chaotic as tend to see, which just one damn thing after another. No, there are forces at work that, and my claim is that I can show what those forces are, what some of those forces are, and how they're the role that they play in shaping our world and our destiny. But what I find really charming in a way about this question of, you know, the global nature of this battle and why it is that democracy has lost ground in the last generation, say, in spite of the fact that I can't see connections. So that I feel like there's got to be something operating underground that make the evolution of the Turkish political system and of the political system of India not so disconnected as they appear. Uh, it, there's a concept in German called Zeitgeist. Zeit meaning time, and Geist meaning spirit. And I believe I understand it correctly how it's used or how it's been used. You don't see a whole lot of it. I think it starts with Hegel's philosophy in the early 19th century. But the idea, it's a way of understanding that time is, a given time isn't just a whole bunch of, millions and millions of pieces and one damn thing happening after another. There are interconnections. If you look at the patterns that are operating, you can sort of sense that there's a spirit of the times. I've always found that idea interesting, how things are, because I spend my time exposing the forces at work, and then it's kind of charming to be brought to realizing that reality is bigger than even my big picture presents. That there is something going on somehow in the world, whatever that is, results in movement in a variety of countries. I mean, in the late 90s, Russia looked like it might become a democracy. I mean, it was working on it. Before Xi came to power in China, there were a lot of reasons for hoping that the future direction of the evolution of this Chinese tyranny was in a greater opening and giving people more liberty and having more freedom of movement of information. That's been reversed under Xi. You want to call him a fascist leader? Whatever the word should be, I want to include him in that category. And Israel moved. So there's, something going on in the world. And I've seen that before and wondered about it. One case that I've found interesting is that I've made a study and wrote a book about the detective story, the Victorian detective story in particular, in which there's the surface of things, and then there's the detective who, in investigating a crime, is able to see the manifestations of what's real and true that's down beneath the surface of things. Sherlock Holmes, of course, is the quintessential reader of the surface, an interpreter of where the crimes are. And I thought there was a zeitgeist kind of a thing in the way, at the same time as Arthur Conan Doyle was writing Sherlock Holmes stories, and other mystery writers of the same general ilk were also writing stories about the body lying on the drawing room carpet. There was arising in Vienna another kind of detective who I think Freud was actually somewhat conscious of Sherlock Holmes being out there as a sort of analog to what he was doing. Here was a guy in very uptight Victorian Europe who was hearing things like Freudian slips, the pathology of everyday life, interpreting dreams and ferreting down beneath the surface and finding out what's really going on. The unconscious, which is maybe can be made a parallel with the crime in the Sherlock Holmes story. the unconscious is putting up meanings and desires that are unconscious and repressed, and the detective can uncover them. And there are some other examples that I've sometimes looked at that, that tell me that in our cultural system, the web of interconnections is very rich, and so rich that it's kind of boggles the mind and exceeds our ability, or at least my ability, to understand. But some things that are important, that are forces, can be identified and shown. And that's what I've been working almost obsessively about, actually. I mean, it's just sort of who I am. You know, I got sidetracked in life for a couple of years back in 1968 when I dropped out of graduate school at the University of Chicago. In 1970, when I got the idea that's at the foundation of all this, it's that book from University of California Press. I had this question about why is the world so troubled and destructive and tormented? I mean, 1968 was a year that was very disturbing, not just to me, but life had dealt me a couple of personal, artillery shells that had softened me up. My dad had died. I'd broken up with my fiance. I'd gone to the University of Chicago to study social thought and clinical psychology. And I was in a town where I had no friends, and I didn't particularly like being in Chicago. But then the world, the war in Vietnam, and my draft notice, and the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and the Chicago Convention, and the Soviet tanks in Czechoslovakia extinguishing the Prague Spring. All of a sudden, the world that I, somewhat innocent and naive, well-educated, but actually sort of assuming that the world was a lot more whole than it actually is, because I had been brought up in a pretty whole family and in a pretty whole America, in an international situation where, we did have to rehearse going into the hallway and crouching by the lockers with our hands over our heads so we don't get hit by flying glass when a nuclear war breaks out. But it was a pretty whole world in terms of how our day-to-day life. I just realized that I had to figure out what made sense to do in a way that I hadn't had to figure out before, because I now saw the world as a place that was out of joint. And whereas when I graduated from college and I envisioned my future, I saw myself writing more stuff along the lines of what I'd written as my senior thesis, what my committee thought was a publishable book about the meaning of heroic tragedy in ancient Greece and Elizabethan England. I was going to fit into the world as it is and do just fine. But if the world was out of joint, then I found myself having to come up with some answer to the question, why is the world so out of joint? And if the world is so out of joint, then it doesn't really make sense for me to just fit into the world. That would make me out of joint. And so I had those two questions that I was sort of wandering around in my life. Not that I wasn't doing anything and supporting myself and learning stuff, but I was a dropout for the first time in my life. And I wasn't the dropout type, but I was deeply troubled and confused and suffering, grief for my father, concern for where everything was heading. And then one day in 1970, I get an answer to the question, why is the world so filled with a destructive force? No, I didn't put it that way. Why is it like this? And I got the answer, and I still think it is. It is really the first step onto the larger human story that I'm trying to convey now. But it is a vital part. It's got to do with that step onto the path of civilization and unleashing a social evolutionary force. And when I got shown that, as I experienced it, I also got an answer to that other question about what should I do with myself. I develop that, articulate it as compellingly as possible, and do everything I could to deliver to my fellow creatures something that I saw that was so impactful that it changed the whole course of my life. I mean, it really blew me away. It really governed my life for the 14 years between that happening. Not that there weren't other adventures along the way, but I wrote a 1,600-page dissertation, got my doctorate in miscellaneous. There are stories there. As I said, I thought that I had been shown something, and I don't have any way of explaining that feeling, but if I'm going to be completely open, I got to tell that piece of it that I can't explain. I felt that at that moment when I saw something, which I really invite you to check out, a betterhumanstory.org, I lay it out as briefly and compellingly as I can, that I made a promise from the bottom of my heart. It was just sort of like a moment I went from confused about my calling to feeling actually called to do something in a way that had never been true of me. I mean, I felt like I had a profession to follow, which was exciting to me about interpreting the human world, the way we humans use symbols and how it operates in cultural systems and our psychology and all that stuff. I felt, very alive, but this was different. I made a promise. And I didn't know what I was promising to, but I've never broken a promise. I don't make them easily. I don't make them lightly. And I made this one, and I was scared when I made it. Because when I try to envision how I might fulfill that promise, there wasn't a very clear notion of either exactly how I would do it, or if I had the ability to really deliver. So it was a long path, and then there came a time in 1984 when that came out, and it actually made not a huge splash, but a big enough splash that I felt I had delivered on my promise. My publicist said when the New York Times came out with what it came out with, she said, well, the New York Times has declared this as an important book. And there were several other things. I felt, okay, on to what's, further along that path. But I was unburdened with, I had felt it many times in that 14-year period. And I came very close to failing at everything that I tried to do, including getting my doctorate. Not failing because I couldn't do the work, but failing because the world closed the doors. And failing to get the book out there. I mean, as I say, there are stories. I had I had paid a price, um, but it was worth it. Well, on the other hand, I had a calling which deeply inspired me. And I felt that I had delivered, and, and that the world was going to pick up this thing that I had done as powerful a job as I could in showing the inescapable conclusions. Like I didn't say that for years and years and years, but it what that I think proves does make it inescapable. Well, those things I said about this is not human nature. We are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. That's an important thing. If you can prove that, that's important. You would think that if somebody asserts that or claims to show that, if it were to prove true, that would be important. And if he claims to show that that step that our species took made it inevitable, the spirit of gangster was going to drive our civilization in directions that we wouldn't have chosen and are not a reflection of our nature, that would have a pretty big impact on how we understand ourselves and being where we are here 10,000 years later. We're on a social evolutionary process that's been out of control, and this book shows it. Well, you would think that if it did show it, that would be an important shift in how we look at ourselves and what our challenges are. So here I lived a turn of events that showed me that my understanding of the world in which I was communicating was different in some ways from what I had assumed. I mean, this thing this idea, go to betterhumanstory.org, really blew me away. I mean, it just shows a lot, and it holds water. I thought that the way it impacted me, all the mental furniture that I had to shift from having studied history and anthropology and biological evolution, it just, put a bunch of things together, and all of a sudden the human story looks really, really different. I thought, okay, if I can put this thing out there in an irresistible way, compelling, it's going to have a big impact on a lot of other people. The thinking world that does try to comprehend what goes on in this this historical process of human societies on this planet. That the people who do care about, well, how are we to understand all this, would feel compelled to go one of three ways. Well, my expectation was that a lot of people would feel compelled to adopt it because I showed it was true. I still think that. I'm here on this video because I think that. And I also think that seeing things that way is going to be helpful. Or anyway, I don't know what I envisioned about, whether people are going to have the book fly out of their hands, oh my God, that everything's different from what I thought, or eureka moments. I don't know what I envisioned, but I just felt like it's going to sit there, and I'd watched the history of ideas some, and I know that ideas do take some time. One of my favorite ideas is Darwin's. And 1859, he publishes The Origin of the Species, and things unfold in ways, some of which kind of mystify me, because he fell out of favor and he lost ground for some time. And it's really one of the biggest truths, about understanding, the cosmos that we live in and the evolution and life on Earth is Darwin's idea. But anyway, I saw that it takes time for things to percolate, and people adopt it, and some people wrestle with it, and the culture has a conversation about it, and it's a process, and that was fine with me. Um, I figured if I can get this thing out there, we humans need to get a handle on our civilization, which is not completely out of control, but importantly out of control. And we've got some time to work on it, work on our understanding. Things don't change overnight. Um, Thomas Kuhn had said that the old ideas get replaced by the new ideas, not by persuading people who held the old ideas, but by the turnover of generations, the people with the old idea. I didn't think that way when I was writing that book. No, I thought that people could be persuaded. I had some illusions about the thinking world. My dad was a guy of real intellectual integrity. I tell the story of what happened to me at Yale in American Studies as a graduate student, and I talk about how my experience at Yale told me that kind of integrity is not to be assumed in the academic world. But with my dad, if you could argue your position compellingly enough so that he saw that it was stronger than his argument, he would graciously yield ground. And according to Thomas Kuhn, the people who have the old ideas they gotta die off. I didn't think that way. I don't know how true that is. I am aware that sometimes people come up with good ideas that are very slow to catch on. There's a doctor in Australia who came up with the idea that the Helicobacter bacterium in somebody's stomach was what's really involved with with stomach ulcers. And I think I've read about how he was right. Eventually, medicine recognized that he was right, and all these people suffering from stomach ulcers could be made whole by giving them the proper antibiotic. But I think I remember that the guy was completely ostracized, that he was punished. And I think there was something like that happened to Pasteur, too, in the same medical field, that, new ideas are... But I think I was pretty naive about resistance. But in any event, growing up in my family with my dad, I thought that since I got my idea out into the thinking world with not just the full-page review in the New York Times, but also being featured in Esquire magazine, in a volume dedicated to men and women under 40 who are changing the nation. I was a nobody for a long time, and it was kind of gratifying to be in that issue as one of like only a couple thinkers, along with people like Eddie Murphy and Jessica Lange and other people in other areas. But okay, someone's calling attention to me, and an international society. I know I may seem to be bragging, but I just want you to know something about what happened with that idea and why I'm here hoping to get a following. The bottom line is, I would have thought that the thinking world would either have had to accept it or struggle with it to see whether this set of ideas, that if it were true, would have important ramifications in a lot of ways, to see if it were true, or to refute it, to show we don't have to spend any more time on this because its falseness, its invalidity can be demonstrated in this way. What I didn't think was possible is what actually happened, which has left me on a mission. And I love the mission. I mean, don't cry for me, Argentina. I mean, I get some jollies out of this whole thing, but I am very, I do feel like, not only my needs, not mainly my needs, but I do think this could have a beneficial impact. So I don't let myself retire. I'm here on a video, looking for a following so that I can get this idea out there far enough. I mean, these ideas are out there some, but not to have any impact at this point. So what happened is none of those three things that I thought must be the way it would be. No refutation. Nobody's even laid a glove on it. I've never even had to write a response to somebody saying, you're not right about this main part of your argument because of this or that. I'm not aware of anybody ever scoring a point off of it. Instead, it's just been ignored. So it made a bit of a splash in 84, 85, and then there was, a little bit of continuation. But after the Cold War ended, and that may or may not be a factor, people stopped paying any attention to it, just ignored. And I've asked myself for over 30 years now, why would the thinking world get something like that gets taken? My publicist says, the New York Times is saying this is an important book. Okay. Then don't you have to deal with it? Why wouldn't you? I don't know the answer to that. I've had people say, "Oh, Andy, you were ahead of your times." That's a phrase I've heard many times, but saying exactly what that means. What is it about the times, say from 1986 to 1992, is ahead of? Anyway, I do worry whether there's something about these times that might not have changed. But I think that maybe there is something about these times. I don't understand either set of times, but I will say this. The better human story that I'm telling, I think, will increase the chances that human civilization will survive if it were to get out there far enough. Be part of the thinking of our civilization enough. And I have no idea what enough is. I think I know that the current degree in which it's part of the thinking of our civilization, not zero, but really not orders of magnitude less than enough. So here I am, a man on a mission still. I do think that if it were to get out there far enough, it would have effects on how people perceived the challenges that we face. And it would have effects on our ability to meet them. I mean, take, for example, this Ukrainian blood on Republican hands. People asking, what does Putin have on Trump, is one form of not seeing what we're up against. We're up against a force of fascism. The force of fascism in the United States and in the world. And in the United States, it's got to do with what's happened to the Republican Party. It's got to be seen in the big picture. And I've been trying for 20 years to show the liberal America that in the big picture. It was 2005 that I went around to Unitarian congregations and the world the Ethical Society in Washington, and talked about the concept of evil, why it is intellectually valid and politically and spiritually important. I mean, liberal America has not had an understanding of that there is a reality in the world which can be shown, which is part of that better human story, that can be defined as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. And I got several different ways of showing that there is something that meets that definition. And I tried to show that, well, I didn't see it in the 1990s when I did see that the force of fascism was rising in the form of Rush Limbaugh, which is why I did lots and lots and lots of talk radio with conservative callers out here in the Shenandoah Valley for a decade, out of the most powerful AM station in Harrisonburg, trying to undo the poisoning of the conservative base mind. In a small place, when he was doing it nationally, Rush Limbaugh. But I didn't see, well, I did see as Clinton was having his presidency that there was something very dark taking over the right. But I really saw it in 2004. And so I've been on a mission to deal with the immediate battle that we've got, which is the forces between the forces in the American power system that advance what's good and constructive and makes America more whole and adds to the well-being of the American people, which are all components of the good, against something which is increasingly clearly aligned with something that's consistently making the human world worse. It has been difficult to get liberal America to see that the nature of our politics had changed over the course of the last 30 couple or 20 years. We'd gone from liberal and conservative America engaging with their half-truths about policy issues to the takeover of conservative America by a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse. It's important to see things whole, to put together the fact that issue after issue, you look at what the Republican Party was becoming before Trump. I mean, you don't have to just personalize this thing. He starts out as a symptom. I mean, he's also now an agent, very dangerous, but he was initially a symptom of what was already there. No sane Republican base would have ever chosen to give this guy presidential powers. But by 2015, this was not a sane Republican base. It was rising. It was there. You could see it. The Republican Party was changing. It was being taken over by something whose coherence you could see. From the first Bush to the second Bush, it was a different party. One was normal, and we could argue about things like tax cuts for the rich. And one was taking the political battle to a whole different level. And it was a level that I could actually show in the big picture was a function of a larger thing. And then looking at the various levels and how they are isomorphically aligned with one another, ultimately get to the point where I could establish, which I claim that I can, that if you want to understand the fundamental nature of the political battle in America over the last generation, and certainly right now, where it's, I think, become much clearer to many more people, the best way of understanding it, I've been trying to convey for 20 years, is a battle between democracy and fascism, which aligns pretty well with decent definitions. Evolutionary perspective allows us to generate definitions that make it reasonable to say that this battle is a battle between, with complications, etc., between good and evil. I claim to be able to show that. I mean, I don't claim that you have to call it that way, but if you define evil, as I do, as a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse, I can show it. I've got 3 or 4 suggestive ways of doing it. Maybe I should do that. I have done that in previous videos a little bit. But it can be seen that, first of all, it's such a coherent force, well, I mean, at different layers, that the Republican Party has become something which is pretty completely described in that way, with few reservations. And I can also show that when a creature takes a step onto the path of civilization into the problem of anarchy and the war of all against all and the selection for the ways of power and the elevation of the spirit of the gangster have a disproportionate say on how civilization will evolve, I think I can show that a destructive force will be an inevitable component at the center of the drama of the species that created civilization, this new life form. It's an integrated picture. Ukraine versus Russia, democracy versus fascism, Trump versus Biden, the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party versus the national security needs of the United States as the leader of the free world. Democracy versus fascism as a global struggle. Tyranny versus top-down versus bottom-up. Brokenness versus wholeness. Death versus life. It's not coincidence that the fascist leader in Russia broke the peace of Europe with his unprovoked aggression to meet his lust for power. The fascist leader of Germany did the same thing in 1939 when he invaded Poland. This is what they do. This is a force of brokenness. But way lower in that hierarchy than fascism is the force of brokenness that inevitably arises with civilization. I have an article that looks forward. I mean, a lot of my thinking has been about how do you explain what all has happened between human beings going from being cultural creatures, but still living continuously with their, in the niche in which they evolved biologically and as hunter-gatherers, to the civilized path to extricating yourself from that order and falling into the disorder that generates a social evolutionary process. It's not a function of human nature. Looking forward, I claim to be able to show, and again, I realize I'm making things that might not be easy to credit, but check on my website for The Fate of Human Civilization. I think I can demonstrate that any creature on any planet will have as the central challenge that it must meet, that becomes inevitable for it to have to meet. Once it steps onto the path of civilization, and its civilization then will inevitably become out of control with selection for power, driving things in certain directions, it's eventually going to have to, it will eventually gain the capacity to destroy itself. I mean, I think I can show that the nature of of culture, which is a cumulative thing, will mean long term there will be a general trend to more and more power being wielded by the civilization. Power in weaponry, power in terms of the impact on the biosphere in which it evolved, and that means that eventually, I mean, if powers increase and increase and increase as a general trend over time, eventually it'll get the power that if that power is used destructively, it will destroy itself. And you can see, we can see that in our times. I mean, we can see that we could destroy ourselves in a nuclear holocaust, and climate change shows that we could destroy ourselves by our recklessness as a civilizational bull in the ecological china shop. We know that now. Previous generations, going back, before the atomic age, well, I mean, people have had visions of the apocalypse, but this is like a extension of possible history based on the forces we can see in operation. We didn't destroy ourselves during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we might have. So clearly, we can't let that kind of game continue indefinitely. We have the ability to destroy ourselves, and we need to make sure that we don't play Russian roulette with that kind of bullet in the chamber. I've talked about that in my writing and on previous videos. So we need to know how to eliminate the potentialities for destroying ourselves, or we will destroy ourselves. And this better human story, I think, helps clarify, where we are in the social evolutionary process and this central challenge that we face, that we need to order our civilization well enough and soon enough that we'll be able to survive on this planet and human beings be able to thrive for the long haul and being compatible with the rest of life on Earth and its needs, partly because we need the biosphere to be healthy for our own sake, and partly because do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Our well-being isn't the only thing in which the good registers. The health of the rest of the living system matters too. It turns out that civilization, it may be an inevitable part of life, of life on a planet, if it gets to evolve long enough. What can get its DNA into the future? Well, we can see that life goes in just a magnificent variety of directions. I mean, they talk about our all having a common ancestor. I'm not sure that I would be able to make a case for exactly why they feel so sure about that. But, there's an oak, a chestnut oak, the tree out there. I kind of love it. It's right my neighbor. It's a cousin of ours, I guess. But anyway, life goes in all kinds of directions. And, if there's a niche, it seems like life will be inventive enough to find a way to fulfill it. I mean, they've got these hydrothermal vents at the bottom of some parts of the ocean. And they got these living things that are living off of, what is it, sulfur or something? And the heat of the vents, something like that. Life is extremely inventive. So why shouldn't it invent an inventive creature? I mean, the direction of ever greater intelligence precedes the emergence of our species or any kind of Homo species. Life has also created chimpanzees, and it's created dolphins, and it's created octopi. All of them are, more intelligent than anything was. Go back, I don't know how far back you have to go for that sentence to be true. I'm guessing if you went back 100 million years, you wouldn't find a brain even as good as an octopus's, but let alone a chimpanzee's, and let alone us. It's one of the strategies that life can take, along with being an oak tree um, or a virus. I mean, they say virus isn't a life form, but uh, I'm not persuaded that's a good way to think. But I've asked a friend of mine who's in that stuff, and I'm not persuaded that the reason. Anyway, life would eventually, on any given planet where life emerges, would likely choose, or I mean, not choose. I mean, it's all impersonal. It's not. Nobody's running the show. I mean, if anybody's running the show, it's nothing I know a thing about. I mean, I love watching the Ten Commandments. I love to see God's role in the whole thing. I love that stuff, but I can't find it in the world that I perceive. So it just unfolds in an opportunistic way and creating a creature that's as smart as we are. Seems like one of the opportunities, and so it created us. If it hadn't created us, would the descendants of beavers in 20 million years have been able to create civilization? I don't know. But it created us, and I'm imagining, given enough time, anywhere else life emerges, it'll look different and it'll be whatever it is. I have no idea how, if it's always got to be carbon, if it's always got to be water. I mean, there are people who study these things, but I think it'll develop in some ways. And a lot of the ways in which it developed on Earth are sort of by circumstance. I mean, if that asteroid hadn't hit the Earth for 65 million years ago, 66, I guess it is, they're saying now, how would life have emerged? I mean, the dinosaurs controlled the planet. What would they be by now? Their descendants, I mean. Anyway, so there's a lot that is thrown up for chance. Maybe some of them are dead ends where you never get to the point where you can create a brain like ours. But anyway, I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen. And eventually it would. And if it does, then that creature is going to be smart enough to develop culture. We know our ancestors were developing speech and they were developing tools and the hands to use them. And we can see some of this stuff in the fossil records. And we can see stuff on that's been painted on the caves from 40,000 years ago that show that there were, things happening. I think that I don't know, when we reach this level of intelligence. I gather that our brains are a little smaller than the Stone Age ancestors' brains, but I don't know if that means we're less intelligent. But in any event, they're plenty intelligent, and that would happen in other places. They would develop culture. That's the advantage of having these brains. That was the strategy that our ancestors took. If you get smart enough, you can do some things really well that chimpanzees don't do. I bet their hunting methods were smarter than other creatures, but they were still living in that niche. And the way culture works, I mentioned that earlier, it's cumulative. There will eventually, presumably, come a time where that creative intelligence that you can assume when you've got culture becoming, over time, more and more the strategic choice of that species, that it will reach a point where they have at least the capacity to change the rules of the game. I mean, other creatures are pretty much confined to operating in the niche in which they evolved biologically. But, our ancestors were smart enough to be able to invent things like taking plants that they had gathered and making gardens out of them, and eventually raising crops out of them, and taking animals that they had hunted and finding the ones that worked well to control and creating herds of them, whether they're reindeer or goats or sheep or whatever. Changing the rules by inventing their own way of life. And what I claim to show is that once you start doing that, once you take a step into being a new kind of life form. And that's what they are. I mean, they're not the gardening horticultural societies at first were probably not all that different from the hunting gathering societies that there had been. And for sure, the people who maybe over some course of generations started adding more and more horticulture and less of the old techniques, they probably had no idea that they were engaged in a historic, more than historic transformation of inventing a new life form. I mean, the guy wrote a book called 40,000 Years Ago. What was his name? Oh, geez. He says that even after they got onto that path, um, thousands of years went by between those first steps. I guess he's talking about 4,000 years ago, and I don't remember what exactly the markers were of that. But from hunting gathering and the beginnings of agriculture or horticulture, agriculture is further down the line, to I don't remember, but the emergence of societies that historians would call civilization, I guess. And when historians have thought of civilization as the emergence of cities, the word civilization is built on the Latin word for cities, which is where the power centers always were. Just like the words police and polite and politics are based on the Greek word for cities, the polis. But anyway, in that 4,000 year word, Jeffrey Bibby was his name. He says that no generation knew they were participating in a process of change. Those are my words. I'm remembering from something in the 1970s that I read. And I think that that's true. Yet, they were engaged in a change because they were creating different kind of societies, a different life form that is the product of human imagination. And these societies are existing in clusters that eventually have to deal with one another, and there is no order to control how they were going to deal with each other. And we saw before how that inevitably leads to war of all against all, a social evolutionary process for this selecting for the ways of power, which means that the spirit of the gangster is going to have a disproportionate say, not because the creature is inherently a gangster, but because among the cultural possibilities and the psychological possibilities, it's going to be some of the ugly things that gain power that are going to get a disproportionate say in shaping the human future. So that's going to happen to any creature. We human beings, I think we can, I don't know how typical, I don't know how many other civil species elsewhere have gone through this process. I'm just guessing. I don't think we're the only ones, but I don't know that we're not the only ones. Billions of galaxies, billions of stars in each one, and planets being aplenty. How can there not be a whole big population of these things that are planets where life evolves, and out of that evolves a creature with a creative imagination that can make culture its main strategy, which leads eventually to inventing a new way of life, which generates a social evolutionary process that enshrines not right word, enthrones the spirit of the gangster to have a disproportionate say. That would happen everywhere. And so there's going to be a challenge that they will eventually face. They're a cultural creature whose culture over the long haul will get more and more and more powerful until it eventually crosses the line into being having the potential to destroy itself. And if it's got that potential, and if it inevitably has unleashed a destructive force, then eventually it's going to essentially be on a kind of a race to see whether that destructive force, which I say inevitably arises, will be controlled by that species before it destroys that species' civilization and maybe the rest of life on that planet. I mean, if we ask ourselves, if there is a scenario for us human beings that, here we are in 2024, and if there's some scenario in the future, not many generations down the line, where we blow ourselves up like we didn't in 1962, if we were to study how did that come about? How did it happen that even though the human species had understood since 1945 that they needed to prevent this kind of thing, it nonetheless happened? I think that we probably can know that a good history of how we got from here to that self-destruction would show that there were aspects of brokenness in human beings and in the human world, like enabling someone like Vladimir Putin to get into power, whatever. Many things would, in terms of the causes and effects in this profoundly complex human world, I think we can believe with some degree of certainty that the main ways in which the things unfold, that determine that things would unfold in that direction, would be other forms of brokenness that preceded it. There'd be a force of brokenness moving through the human world, culminating in the nuclear holocaust. And I've done a job on some previous videos showing how brokenness in the human world, having to do with the systems that would generate a fossil fuel industry, willing to sacrifice the human future for its own short-term profits. That happened because of the lack of control over a force of brokenness of a different kind and of the same kind. There'd be brokenness in terms of the kind of things that markets create over time, in terms of industries. We've seen that in tobacco and asbestos and now fossil fuels. That can be brokenness in terms of the lack of integrity of people who are willing to sacrifice things in order to gain power and wealth for themselves. Controlling corporate boardrooms. That can be brokenness in terms of the greed of people like the Koch brothers, who were willing to sacrifice our children and grandchildren in spite of their billions to cripple our ability to take the path of wholeness and deal with responsibly with the challenge that the climate scientists have been telling us that we're facing for more than 30 years. All kinds of brokenness would lead to the worst case climate scenario unfolding, and the one that's unfolding has all got a fair amount of what in the past would have looked like more worst case, because the ways brokenness has operated. And brokenness also in America, having a political system in which money can buy political power. I mean, the fossil fuel industry has been able to buy the Republican Party. And that Republican Party has been able to paralyze the country from being able to take actions that are obviously our moral responsibility to do. And we should do it out of love even if we didn't do it out of moral. But, we have a brokenness in our political system, which is making more top down what we're supposed to have is bottom up, where the people actually choose and not the money. And the brokenness on the Supreme Court that handed down a Citizens United decision, with the brokenness of their falsehoods that they knew were better, that their decision wasn't going to open the floodgates to corruption by the money power. They knew better than that. They're not stupid. They're corrupt. Anyway, brokenness begets brokenness. And on our planet, we know that if we end up having two big nuclear powers go to all-out war with each other, or if we destroy this planet, it will be an expression of a force of brokenness that we can trace moving through the human world, which is one of the things I say that I do to demonstrate the reality of there being a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse. I find all this stuff really exciting. We are engaged in a huge drama because we took that step 10,000 years ago. And like any other creature would, we're engaged in a huge drama about whether we're going to be able to get our act together quickly enough. And I think it really helps in order to do that, to understand what it is we're up against. And again, that book up there is called What We're Up Against, the destructive force that we're at work in our world and how we can defeat it. And one of the manifestations of that destructive force is what the Republicans are doing as allies of fascism. Fascists domestically, fascists on the world stage. Ukrainian blood is on the Republicans' hands because they are acting as allies of this fascist power in Moscow. It's not what Trump is up against. It's what we're up against. Trump is up against some blackmail demand by Putin. Like I said, I can't think of anything worse than what we already know about Trump. Trump is helping Putin. He's not his servant. Putin helps Trump too. I've wondered whether Putin's efforts, I'd like to ask this question of Andrew Weissman, for whom I have a huge amount of respect. I mean, he is super bright, and he's sort of a sterling representative of the rule of law. I would like to ask him, without the Russians, would Trump have been elected president in 2016? I don't know the answer to that. I am suspicious that there's a real possibility that without Putin, Trump wouldn't have had. But boy, what a bonanza. If Putin made Trump president, what a bonanza out of his investment. I mean, imagine how he's licking his lips thinking that he could get Trump back in the White House, the guy who only dabbled in a way in terms of committing crimes against the American Constitution till the end when he attempted to pull off a coup d'etat. And now it looks like he's ready to, outright change our regime into something where the Justice Department is just a tool of the tyrant. Like Beria was the tool of Stalin's terror. Wow, what a bonanza. It's important to see the big picture. In the immediate battle, it's important to see that we need to defeat, wipe out to the greatest extent possible Trump and the Trump party. And then in the medium term, to come to grips with what we should understand about where fascism right now is getting its power. Now, I was watching how people like Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich and the Fox News and Karl Rove were corrupting the Republican base that I was throughout, say, 1992 to 2002, hundreds of hours of talk radio talking to the Republican base out here in the Shenandoah Valley. It gave me a ringside seat to see them change. I didn't necessarily understand the extent to which they were getting changed. I was surprised in 2016 that pretty much the whole Republican base once Trump got the nomination because he already appealed to 40%. But the whole Republican base was willing to, go to the ballot box and vote for him. Something strange had happened to them from the time that I was talking to them when they were still a normal Republican base back in the 90s. I got to watch it happen, but it's such an extraordinary accomplishment in a free society to be able to convince so many people of so many things that are so obviously not true. It has exposed to me the limits of my understanding of human psychology, that you could get tens of millions of people thinking that the election was stolen from Donald Trump and that he's being prosecuted for political reasons. I mean, how can you have any intelligence, pay any attention, and believe either of those things? But apparently you can't. And already before Trump came on the scene, the Republican base was such that in 2015, they could look at Donald Trump and say, he's our guy. We want to give him the powers of the presidency. I mean, he's exactly what you don't want to give the powers of presidency to. He's utterly selfish. He's ruthless. He doesn't obey any laws, or he shows contempt for anything that would constrain his freedom of action. He's narcissistic and utterly selfish. He doesn't give a damn about anybody but himself and meeting his needs. He's willing to sacrifice other people to get what he wants. He's the kind of guy who would be unforgiving of Mike Pence, who gets told by Dan Quayle and Judge Ludig that he must obey the Constitution and not do what Trump wants. He's willing to send a mob off to kill him. That's the kind of guy. I mean, we didn't see all that in 2015-16 before he became the Republican nominee, but we saw a lot of terrible things about Donald Trump. Punch him in the nose, And we've been exposed to one thing after another. I mean, you can't imagine a more impeachable president. And I was already campaigning for that the House should investigate and impeach Donald Trump in 2017. But liberals are always very cautious about joining the battle. And the conservatives were already corrupt. The guy I ran against was running in 2017. He was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, the guy who beat me by the usual 2-1 margin. He was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and he was fully committed to defending the criminal rather than investigating him. The Republican base in 2015 was the place from which the brokenness flowed. I think that we need to look at the period, say, from the rise of Limbaugh in 1990 and through the rise of these other guys until 2015 to understand what was done to them that they would want to nominate and be willing eventually to vote for this fascist thug who stiffed people, who bragged on the Hollywood Access tape about sexually molesting women because he was a star. Something happened to them. And in any event, even if we beat Donald Trump, that's the first order of business, and consign the Republican Party in its present form to as far into the interstices of the American power system, into obscurity as it's possible to do. And I've been saying this for a while. Liberal America failed to fight for the hearts and minds of the conservatives back in the 90s, and I have experience about that. And we've never been very good about recognizing that they are that we need to be our brother's keepers, because that's the nature of our democracy. We depend on having people who are sane, who haven't bought a whole false picture of the world. When I tried to become a bigger voice on the radio and dealt with liberal gatekeepers, I was told by a couple of them, Limbaugh's audience is not our concern. I think we can see. We really got to be our brother's keepers. We're not going to have a healthy democracy while we have a Republican base that plays the role it now plays as a reservoir of force of destruction, of fascism. I mean, for example, not only did they choose Donald Trump, but at some point, apparently before I was able to understand that was the case, they became Trump's instrument, his willing instrument, sufficiently to allow him to use the Republican base to control the whole Republican Party. We know from many witnesses that a lot of the Republicans in Congress don't want to be just instruments of Trump, but they're afraid of him. They're afraid, first of all, that he will call out the Republican base and kill them politically. He's done it to people. He did it to Sanford, South Dakota, who had the gall to say something Trump didn't like. He's done it to Liz Cheney. But apparently, this fascist force has even made political violence a source of intimidating Republicans into doing Trump's bidding. If he doesn't primary them, they're also afraid of what it'll take to protect themselves and their families. There was an op-ed in the New York Times recently by a guy named, I think, David French, who's, you look at his background, he's pretty far to the right, but he's not a Trumper. But he's a National Review type right-winger. He talks about how Republicans have sometimes done things because they're afraid for their families. One guy voted not to certify the legitimate outcome of the 2020 election. We've read about this before, this op-ed piece, because he was afraid for his family. I mean, we can look at what happened to Nancy Pelosi's. We're back. Fascism generates a brown shirt kind of core. Most of the Trump supporters are not threats to attack judges and witnesses, but enough are to affect people. I was stunned, actually, to read that Mitt Romney is paying $5,000 a day for security for himself and his family. And I don't know how wide that family thing is, but $5,000 a day, that's a lot. He's not a fool, so we've got a brown shirt core out there that's having an impact. And the battle that's going on right now with the Republican, I sure hope they get rid of that judge in Florida, that judge Eileen Cannon. I mean, she's so obviously corrupt for Trump. I mean, I'm hoping that she won't reverse what she said that Jack Smith is saying she should reconsider, which applies the wrong law with the wrong result that would threaten witnesses in a way that the system of justice is determined to protect. I hope that she gets pig-headed so that Jack Smith can appeal to the 11th Circuit, because then I hope that the 11th Circuit will issue another scathing opinion like they've done twice before when this judge Trump appointed has behaved. It's disgusting. Anyway, my guess is that she'll see that she needs to prevent Jack Smith from giving Jack Smith that ammunition, because I think there's a good chance that if Jack Smith is given that ammunition, he can go to the 11th court and have her taken off the court. Andrew Weissman talked about there being a sort of a polite recusal, where they don't exactly chastise her, they just gently say, we're going to reassign this. Fascism versus the rule of law is a multi-dimensional battle in this moment. A lot of it having to do with, of course, with Trump, but a lot of it having to do with a lot of other things. You know, you can go down to Kari Lake in Arizona, where she tries to pull off this fabric of falsehood challenge in the courts with no evidence in order to seize power. And I kind of wondered, does she believe what she's saying? I mean, there's different forms of brokenness. There's the people who are crazy and the people who knowingly purvey the lie. And with Trump, I struggle with, how much is one and how much is the other. Eventually, I came to believe he actually did believe that his crowd was bigger than Obama's at the time of his inauguration. I can't remember what the evidence was, but there's craziness and there is utter dishonesty. And, this is a fascist thing. And craziness, one of the major biographies of Hitler is called The Psychopathic God. And utter dishonesty, Hitler's propagandist was the one who wrote about the big lie. If it's big enough, people will think, oh, he couldn't be lying about a thing like that. And if it's told often enough, Goebbels said, people will eventually believe it. I read an article back 20 years ago that Newt Gingrich was actually a student of Goebbels' propagandistic methods. I doubt that Trump has read Goebbels. He's not a scholar of things. But he sure knows how to use the big lie. It's a fascist thing. It's a broken thing. And when we're engaged in this battle of democracy versus fascism, even if we win this upcoming major showdown at the ballot box in 2024, it is high time that we start giving real thought to how do we move the minds of people who have bought into lies and are operating on the basis of a crazy picture of reality. How do we bring them back to sanity and a contact with reality and their own better selves? I'm not saying that I understand how to do it. I have a weekly op-ed that I send out into the couple of newspapers, Lynchburg and up at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, where I mostly send out messages, which is my effort to bring people back to sanity. I don't know that I'm succeeding at all, but we need to take that on. I mean, the short-term battle is at the ballot box, but in the wake of that, we got to remember that this base chose Trump. It allowed Trump to weaponize them so that the Republicans in the Senate would acquit him, though he was the most impeachable president we could have imagined. And then even after he pulled off an attempted coup d'etat, the base told the party, we're sticking with Trump. Even if he parts from you, we're sticking with him. And that allowed him to essentially make Liz Cheney have to commit political suicide, at least in terms of her elective office with the base, if she was going to have any integrity at all. That's the base. It was the base that made Kevin McCarthy move from talking honestly about what Trump had done immediately after the insurrection to go down to Mar-a-Lago and kiss the ring. He had gotten the message. You want to survive politically? You got to kiss this fascist's ring. The base is what enabled that to happen. If the base had said, like Republicans would have at the time of Reagan, I believe, we believe in the Constitution. We're not just pretending to believe in the Constitution. I admit that Trump, trampled on some constitutional things with the Iran-Contra controversy, but still, he was a guy who played mostly by the rules, more than Nixon did. We believe in the Constitution. I think that this base would have said they would not have ever countenanced somebody telling them such obvious lies about the election being stolen. They wouldn't have gone with it back in 1983 when Reagan started campaigning on Morning in America, a positive vision. No, they had changed. And they stuck with Trump. And that's what still enables the Republican Party to be a force of fascism. The Republican Party was already on the road to fascism, which is always about opportunism too, I think, not about integrity. They were already on the road to fascism before Trump arose, which is why I went around the country talking about the concept of evil. But the base received from the fascistic core that's at the center of this power thing. They received from Rush Limbaugh and his backers and Newt Gingrich and his backers and Fox News and Murdoch as his backer and then Karl Rove and on the unholy alliance of forces that he put together. They received messages that changed their state of mind so that they became a reservoir that a fascist could tap into. I don't think the Koch brothers had in mind that there would be that Donald Trump would make the Republican Party his instrument. That's why they're giving money to Nikki Haley. But fascism was already there. They got it by changing the Republican base into something that was crazy and detached from reality in a way that they hadn't been in generations past. This was not the kind of people who elected Reagan or, Eisenhower. This is a different Republican Party. And liberal America was very slow to recognize it, which is why I hope I can get a following that will help me by looking into how we can see things whole. Republican Party, force of fascism, force of brokenness, the consequences of the evolutionary step out of the evolutionarily evolved biological order. All that stuff can be woven into a coherent picture. And when we see that picture, we understand the nature of the battle that we're engaged in. We won't be so slow to see that a force of brokenness has arisen. We won't be so understanding that being the civilization creating creatures means that we're going to have to deal with something dynamic between two coherent forces. I've been talking mostly about the force of brokenness, but there's another one that I talk about, which is a biologically evolved force of wholeness that there is at the center of any civilization creating creatures drama, a battle between two coherent forces that are reasonable to call a battle between good and evil, which is why any creature that emerges out of the biologically evolved order and creates this other disorder that needs to be brought under control will have at the center of its drama, from the beginnings of civilization on to beyond where we are now, will have a drama that's best understood as a battle between those two coherent forces that act very much like good and evil. If we see things whole, we see the battlefield more whole. We will be more motivated and impassioned with moral and spiritual passions to fight that battle and win it, and not hang back like liberal America did while this thing was taking over the Republican Party. Rush Limbaugh's audience is our concern. All this stuff is our concern. There is a large picture in which forces of wholeness and forces of brokenness are embattled. And if we're either going to get our act together by bringing the force of destructiveness under control, by following the guidance of the forces of wholeness that we have evolved within us, or we're going to destroy ourselves. There isn't a middle course. I think people sort of assume that because we've muddled through a lot of crappy history, we can just keep on muddling through. No, we're not going to just muddle through. That's not in the cards, because we have become so powerful that we're playing Russian roulette. And you can't play Russian roulette for the long term. You can't pull the trigger a number of times. We know what happens when someone playing Russian roulette keeps playing it. There's only one way it can end. So we got to change the rules of the game. And that involves seeing these forces clearly, working to bring them under control, ordering our civilization well enough and soon enough so that life on Earth and we human beings can survive and thrive for the long haul. I'll be back on, if not before, I'll be back on Monday to live stream at 1 o'clock. I don't mean 1 o'clock, 11 o'clock. And I might do other things in the meanwhile. If you want to see, if you'd like to know if all the things that I've claimed to be true can be shown, there's a bunch of other videos, and there's the writings that you can find on my website, betterhumanstory.org. And if you're a Drew Barrymore, and you've been listening to me for the first time, and this is our first date, I hope that I've made it plausible enough that you'll come back for a second date. Subscribe to this channel. I do think that this big picture, this better human story, can at least marginally improve the odds that the things that we care about on this world, the good things, the things that we find sacred, whether they're articulated in the Declaration of Independence, or they're shown in the lyrical lines of John Muir looking at the beauty of the natural world at Yosemite, or any of the other places that we find things that are wonderful and that we don't want to have destroyed. If you care, check it out. If I haven't managed to make my claims plausible, that's my failure. But that's what I'm trying to do here as Adam Sandler on this first date. So take a look if you think that this is something you'd want to know. If it held water, you'd want to see how it all laid out. Thank you. Bye-bye.